his own. Like all who petitioned the oracle, Croesus had to walk past an inscription on the temple, 2 words that could be read as an exhortation or a warning. Know thyself. No matter what else a Pythia revealed, each petitioner ultimately had to find their own answers. In the summer of 1998, Hale and de Boer returned to Delphi for a second time to complete their own inquiry. They intended to prove that the source of the legendary oracle's powers was not a myth, but a geological and archaeological reality. To take their investigations further, de Boer and Hale petitioned the Greek government for unprecedented access to Delphi. Working with the site's archaeologists, they conducted a detailed geological field survey that ended months of speculation. Under the Temple of Apollo, de Boer and Hale found not 1 fault line, but 2.
Behind me is the exposure of a very large major fault that's also known as being active. We named it the Delphi fault. Now, aside from the Delphi fault, which sort of trends east-west here, there is at the oracle site another fault that trends north-south, and the 2 intersect.
The point of intersection forming an almost perfect X is Delphi. But how could they prove it ran through the sacred Adyton itself? To find the answer, the scientists searched for evidence in the water pushed up along active fault lines.
One of the first things we saw were big mounds of a rock, which is known as travertine, which is a rock that is formed above springs when the water, which is warmer and at deeper level, comes to the surface and cools. And so that meant, of course, that there were quite a number of springs.
Using flags to mark each point where there was evidence of spring activity, a pattern soon emerged.
They seemed to be on a line, and that line was sort of a northerly-southerly kind of line cutting through here. And so it became very obvious now that you not only had the fractures, one, but you also had groundwater rising along those fractures and forming these mounds of travertine that we find so abundant on the site and has been also being used in the construction of the temple.
An examination confirmed that the temple was built on an ancient spring, one that was active at the time of construction.
One exceptional feature of the Temple of Apollo is the fact that a system of drains, pipes and conduits crossed its foundations, bringing water from springs further up the slope through the foundations of the temple to the Cassiopeis fountain situated immediately to the south of the temple.
It would be crazy to build a temple on top of a spring unless you needed to. This foundation is actually punctured by these conduits for water, and to have active water coming up into your building, into the very foundations of your building, is not a sensible thing to do if you're interested in solid, secure foundations.
An interesting architectural feature of the Adyton is the fact that it does not coincide with the axial line of the temple, but instead it is slightly pushed to the south, slightly off-centered, as it were. I think the best explanation for this positioning would be to say that the sanctum aimed to shelter a specific geological feature, such as the fissure.
As Hale discovered, Delphi was not the only Apollo temple constructed on and around a geographical feature.
In Asia Minor, what is today Turkey, there were oracle temples, such as Claros and Didyma, deliberately built over springs. And most extraordinary of all is the example of the Temple of Apollo at Hierapolis in Turkey, where a similar opening in the foundations was a vent for subterranean gases and emission of CO2 so toxic that any small animal wandering into its path would be killed. And when I visited the temple, there were still dead sparrows all over the ground.
But the gas released at Delphi was not toxic. Instead, it appeared to have an intoxicating or narcotic effect. So what gas was it?
And that is a very difficult thing, obviously, to try to prove, because gases, well, you know, they come to the surface, evaporate, go up in the atmosphere, dilute, and that's it. They're gone forever.
It was the travertine found at what is believed to be the Pythia's underground spring that provided a plausible answer.
Travertine is a calcium carbonate rock that's formed very rapidly when a spring comes up from underground and pressure is released. And when that happens, CO2 is degassed and calcium carbonate precipitates. And this happens very rapidly.
This travertine material that you see in here actually is extremely porous. It's like a sponge. You see many, many small holes all through it. And that means that in those holes, it is possible that some of the gases, which theoretically rose with the waters, were captured. And what we need to do then is take samples of the travertine. They need to be crushed, and then those gases hopefully will actually be released and we can analyze those chemically.
Environmental chemist Geoffrey Chanton took water samples and tested the travertine.
We took these rock samples and we chopped them up into small little pieces and put them into a flask. First we dissolved the rocks with acid because it's a carbonate rock, and so in acid it's quite soluble and it dissolves and liberates all the gases.
What Chanton found would go far to explain the mysterious events at Delphi, but only after his scientific quest took several unexpected turns. Little is known about the lives of the priestesses at Delphi. They were kept in isolation. Their bodies were inviolate. On the ordained sacred days that they entered the Aditon, they underwent fasting and purification to help calm and prepare them for the ordeal ahead. The ancient rituals were violated only once, and it led to disaster.
On this occasion, a very important set of people arrived on a wrong day. They forced the woman down, even though she knew it was the wrong day. Prophecies were only supposed to be given from the tripod, inspired by the god, through the voice of the Pythia on the 7th day after each new moon.
Why those specific months? That may have something to do with the amount of water and gases that come to the surface. The Pythia, of course, went into this small, narrow room, never knowing really how much gas there would be. And under most normal conditions, there was just a little, enough for her to go into this euphoria. In this specific case, most likely, she was poisoned by too much gas.
Plutarch describes it like she was like a laboring ship. She was in heavy seas. She began to rave, to shout, to thrash about, and she ultimately rushed toward the doors, threw herself against them, and the priests and the consultants were also frightened. They all ran away. When they came back, she was lying unconscious on the ground. She only lived a few days before she died.
What type of gas produced such a lethal effect? In his laboratory in Florida, chemist Geoffrey Chanton found the first clues in the travertine sample.
We found that there were traces of methane and ethane in this rock that was deposited on the walls of the temple where the spring came up inside the temple.
Methane and ethane are organic solvents, hydrocarbons closely related to propane, butane, and other common household flammables. When inhaled, they act as both an asphyxiate and an anesthetic, depriving the brain of oxygen. When abused, they can have devastating effects on the nervous system. Could these substances have caused the Pythia's trances? The team then called on toxicologist Dr. Henry Spiller.
At the time, I was working on a study of enhanced